My doctor called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing he said was, "Thomas, I need you to come back in. We're running this test again." Not because something was wrong, because something was so right that he didn't trust the machine. That was the second time he'd tested my PSA in 6 weeks. Then he called me again, 2 weeks after that. Third test, same result. My PSA had dropped from 8 to 2 in 14 months, without surgery, without medication, without a single prescription. And I'm going to tell you exactly what I did, because I spent 2 years of my life absolutely terrified, and nobody should have to feel that way alone. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not a doctor. I'm not a researcher with a lab coat and a grant. I'm a 65-year-old man who was sitting in a urologist's office 4 years ago being told that a PSA of 8 was concerning and that we needed to talk about options. I know what that feels like. That cold clinical language that somehow makes everything more frightening, not less. I know what it's like to drive home from that appointment and sit in your car in the driveway for 20 minutes because you're not ready to go inside and tell your wife. I know what it's like to type your symptoms into Google at 2 in the morning after you've already gotten up 3 times to use the bathroom. If any of that sounds familiar, stay with me, because what I discovered on this journey is something I genuinely wish someone had walked me through 4 years ago, and I'm going to cover every piece of it today. I'll get to the exact protocol in a few minutes, the specific things I changed, in the specific way I changed them. And there's one thing in particular I almost skipped over because it seemed too simple, too obvious. That one thing turned out to be the piece that tied the whole protocol together. So stay with me all the way through, because the order this unfolds in actually matters. Let me tell you what was happening inside my body, because understanding this was genuinely the first thing that shifted everything for me. PSA stands for prostate-specific antigen. It's a protein your prostate produces, and a small amount of it naturally leaks into your bloodstream. That's completely normal. A PSA below 4 is generally considered within the normal range. But when your number starts climbing, when it crawls from a 2 to a 4, then from a 4 to a 6, then up to an 8 like mine, your prostate is sending a distress signal. It's working too hard, producing too much of that protein, and that almost always means it's either inflamed, enlarged, or both. For me, it was both. My prostate was enlarged, what doctors call benign prostatic hyperplasia, or BPH, and it was chronically inflamed. The reason why is something most doctors don't have nearly enough time to explain during a standard appointment. Starting in your mid-40s, your testosterone levels begin to decline. What most men don't know, because nobody tells them in a 10-minute office visit, is that as testosterone drops, the body compensates by converting more of it into something called DHT, or dihydrotestosterone. DHT is testosterone's more aggressive cousin. It's up to 5 times more potent at the cellular level, and it locks onto prostate cell receptors and activates a growth signal. More DHT means a bigger prostate. A bigger prostate squeezes the urethra that runs through its center. Squeeze the urethra, and you get a weak stream, urgency, hesitancy, and those miserable nighttime trips to the bathroom. That's the engine driving this entire cycle. The physical symptoms were relentless, but the emotional weight was something else entirely. 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a night getting up. I was running on maybe 4 broken hours of sleep. My wife and I had started sleeping in separate rooms because I was disrupting her every single night. I'd stopped playing golf on Saturday mornings, something I'd done for over 20 years, because I was too exhausted to enjoy it and too anxious about being out on the course without a bathroom nearby. I actually turned down a road trip with my 2 adult sons, something they'd been planning for months, because the idea of long stretches of highway with no rest stops filled me with a kind of low-grade panic I couldn't explain to them without feeling ashamed. These are not small inconveniences. These are the moments that make up a life, and they were disappearing on me. The inflammation side of this is where the PSA number gets really interesting, and it's a layer most men never hear about. When your prostate tissue is chronically inflamed, driven by poor diet, oxidative stress, elevated cortisol from chronic stress, a sedentary lifestyle, the cells in the prostate become what I describe as leaky. More PSA escapes into the bloodstream than normal. So a high PSA isn't just a reflection of prostate size. It's a measure of how irritated and inflamed those cells are. My urologist touched on this point briefly, then almost immediately pivoted to a conversation about alpha blockers and pharmaceutical 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. He wasn't wrong to mention them. Those medications work, and for some men they're the right choice. But he never asked what might be causing the inflammation. He never suggested that addressing the root cause was even a possibility worth exploring. That gap, that unasked question, became the starting point for everything that followed. I spent the 6 months after my diagnosis doing what I suspect a lot of men in this situation do. I read obsessively. I was on WebMD. I was deep in Healthline articles. I was spending late nights in prostate health forums, full of men in their 50s and 60s, sharing notes like it was the most important project of their lives. Because for all of us, it was. I'd say some of the best education I received in that period came not from doctors, but from other patients. Men who'd been through the fear, done the research, tried things, tracked results, and were generous enough to report back honestly, including the things that hadn't worked. I also connected with a functional health consultant who specialized in working with men dealing with prostate issues. I'll be direct, I was skeptical. I've never been the kind of person who reaches for the miracle supplement solution. But what this consultant offered me wasn't a pitch. It was a framework, a way of thinking about the prostate not as a broken part to be fixed, but as a system that had been pushed out of balance by years of accumulated inputs. Diet, stress, sleep, inflammation, hormonal shifts. That framework changed how I looked at my own situation, and I spent the next several months cross-referencing every piece of it against published research, Healthline citations, WebMD summaries, peer-reviewed clinical studies. I wasn't willing to trust anything I couldn't verify. I needed to understand the mechanism, not just the recommendation. What I found surprised me, not because the individual pieces were exotic or expensive or hard to access, but because the results, when you combined them deliberately and consistently, were so much greater than anything I'd expected. By month 6 into the protocol, my PSA had come down to 6. By month 10, it was at 4. By month 14, it landed at 2. My doctor ran that test a second time, then a third. I'll tell you his exact words at that third appointment before this video is over, and it's something I've carried with me ever since. So what did I actually do? Walk with me through this, because the details matter, and vague advice helps nobody. The first thing I tackled was the DHT problem directly. Think of your prostate cells as having tiny locks on their surface, and DHT is precisely shaped to fit those locks and switch on a growth signal. The pharmaceutical approach, finasteride, blocks the enzyme called 5-alpha reductase that converts testosterone into DHT in the first place. It works, but it comes with a side effect profile that includes sexual dysfunction and mood disruption. And I wanted to explore whether the natural version of that same mechanism was a viable alternative before committing to a prescription. What I found is that certain plant-derived compounds act as natural 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, interfering with that same conversion without the same pharmaceutical risk profile. The most thoroughly researched of these is saw palmetto. I know, you've probably seen it on a shelf and assumed it was another overhyped supplement with a pretty label. That was my assumption too, but a 2012 Cochrane review, which is among the most rigorous forms of evidence review in medicine, found that standardized saw palmetto extract produced meaningful improvements in urinary symptom scores in men with BPH. The critical detail, and this is where I believe most men who try saw palmetto and report no results go wrong, is the quality and form. You need a lipophilic extract standardized to between 85 and 95% fatty acids. Most budget brand products don't come close to meeting that standard. I was taking 320 milligrams daily of a high-quality standardized extract, split into 2 equal doses with food. The second major pillar was beta-sitosterol. This is a plant sterol that occurs naturally in nuts, seeds, avocados, and several vegetables, and it works through a related but distinct mechanism. It reduces the inflammatory cytokine signals inside prostate tissue while also limiting DHT's ability to activate those growth receptors. A Healthline reviewed analysis of multiple clinical trials found that men supplementing with beta-sitosterol showed significantly improved urinary flow rates and meaningfully reduced post-void residual urine volume compared to placebo groups. I was taking approximately 300 milligrams daily. Third, and I want to pause here because this is the thing I nearly didn't pursue, lycopene. That's the pigment that makes tomatoes red, and it turns out to be one of the most potent antioxidants that prostate tissue accumulates in high concentrations. A study in the journal Cancer Epidemiology found that men with higher circulating lycopene levels had consistently lower PSA scores. A Harvard Health review found that men who consumed cooked tomato products 10 or more times per week had a 35% lower risk of prostate-related problems compared to men who rarely ate them. The key bioavailability factor, and this is important, is that lycopene from cooked tomatoes, consumed alongside a small amount of healthy fat, is dramatically more absorbable than lycopene from raw tomatoes. I started eating cooked tomato dishes at least 5 days a week, always with olive oil, and I supplemented with 15 milligrams of lycopene daily to stay consistent on the days my diet fell short. I almost skipped lycopene entirely because tomatoes felt too mundane, too everyday. That would have been a significant mistake. Alongside the targeted supplementation, I made a serious dietary overhaul. Processed foods came out almost entirely. Alcohol came out. I was a glass or two of wine at dinner type. And I want to tell you that cutting alcohol alone reduced my nighttime urgency noticeably within 3 weeks. That's not a coincidence. Alcohol is both a bladder irritant and a diuretic, which is essentially the worst combination possible for a man already dealing with BPH symptoms. Red meat I reduced significantly without eliminating entirely, replacing a lot of those calories with fatty fish, walnuts, and dark leafy greens. And green tea became my morning anchor, 3 cups daily, because EGCG, the primary catechin in green tea, has been shown in multiple peer-reviewed studies to reduce PSA levels and inhibit the kind of prostate cell proliferation that drives BPH progression. Right in the middle of all this tracking and adjusting, I ran into a wall. The protocol was working. The numbers were moving in the right direction, but I kept losing the thread. I'd miss a day of tracking and then lose a week. I'd forget whether I'd taken my evening supplement. I was keeping a notebook, then a spreadsheet, and I kept missing the bigger patterns, like the clear connection between my sleep quality on a given night and how severe my symptoms were the following evening, or the correlation between high-stress work weeks and sudden upticks in urgency. A friend from my prostate health community mentioned an app called the Tomato app that he'd been using to track exactly this kind of thing. I'll put the link in the pinned comment below. Once I started using it, the protocol stopped being something I had to constantly manage in my head and became something I could actually see and sustain. The patterns it surfaced changed how I adjusted things week to week. Moving on, because the protocol has more ground to cover. Exercise. Not grueling, not punishing. Consistent, moderate aerobic movement. A 2016 analysis in the journal European Urology found that physically active men maintain significantly lower PSA levels than sedentary men across age groups, independent of diet and BMI. The mechanism runs two ways. Aerobic exercise reduces systemic inflammation at the molecular level, and it lowers circulating insulin and IGF-1, which are hormones that can act as growth signals for prostate cells when they run too high. I started walking 45 minutes every single morning, 6 days a week. Not running, not a gym membership, walking. Within 8 weeks, my evening urgency had noticeably softened. My sleep was still fragmented, but less severely. The last piece of the protocol was the one I resisted the longest, because I belonged to a generation of men who were raised to believe that stress was not a medical issue. It was a character issue, something you pushed through. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, directly amplifies the inflammatory pathways that keep prostate tissue irritated and PSA elevated. I started a 10-minute slow breathing practice every morning before I looked at my phone, before coffee, before anything else. Inhale for 4 seconds, exhale for 8. The exhale twice as long as the inhale. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, blunts cortisol, and it takes 10 minutes. It sounds so small. The impact was not small. Let me give you some perspective on why this combination of approaches outperformed anything I could have done with a single supplement or a single habit change. A meta-analysis published in 2023 examined lifestyle-based interventions in men with elevated PSA and found that the combination of targeted dietary modification, regular aerobic exercise, and evidence-based supplementation reduced PSA scores by an average of 28% over 12 months. My reduction over 14 months was 75%, from 8 to 2. When I sat down with my urologist for what turned out to be the third PSA retest, he had all 3 results printed on paper in front of him. He looked at those numbers, looked at me, and said, "Thomas, I don't know exactly what combination of things you've been doing, but the data speaks for itself. I can't argue with results like this. Keep doing it." That's the moment I return to mentally when I'm tired, when I feel like relaxing the protocol, when I wonder if it still matters. It still matters. I also want to tell you about Robert, because his story is different from mine in ways that might resonate more with some of you. I met Robert in that same prostate health forum I mentioned earlier. He posted for the first time when he was 67, and his PSA was sitting at 11. His urologist was already discussing biopsy protocols and procedural options. Robert was scared in a way that came through clearly even in text on a screen. He mentioned in his post that he'd moved out of the bedroom he shared with his wife because he was up so many times each night that he felt guilty about disrupting her sleep, and that the physical separation was doing something to their relationship that scared him more than the test results. He reached out to me privately after I shared some of what I'd learned, and we began trading information over the following months. He implemented a modified version of this protocol, adjusted for his specific circumstances, always with his doctor monitoring him throughout. At his 6-month follow-up, his PSA had come down to 7. At 12 months, it was 4. He sent me a message after that second result. He said he'd sat in his car in the hospital parking lot and cried, not because of the number specifically, but because that morning he and his wife had slept in the same room for the first time in nearly a year. The number was the evidence. What the number represented was his life coming back to him. I want to address an objection directly because I hear it regularly and I want to respect it rather than dismiss it. Some of you have doctors who've told you there's no solid evidence for natural or lifestyle-based approaches to PSA management. I understand that position, and I don't say this to dismiss your doctor. Physicians work within time constraints that make deep dives into nutritional research difficult. They're managing risk across dozens of patients a day, and they naturally gravitate toward interventions with the most established evidence base. But lycopene, beta-sitosterol, and saw palmetto are not fringe compounds. They appear in peer-reviewed publications. They're referenced in Healthline and WebMD with proper citations. The research is not perfect. No research is. But the signal is consistent enough to take seriously. The key insight I'd offer is this. The natural approach and the medical approach are not opponents. They can and should work together. My urologist is now an active partner in what I do, not a skeptic watching from the sidelines. The deeper principle, the one that changed everything once I finally understood it, is that the prostate does not exist in a vacuum. It's embedded in a whole system, and that system includes your gut, your sleep, your stress hormones, your metabolic health, your cardiovascular fitness. I discovered, for example, that poor gut health disrupts how your body processes and clears estrogen. When estrogen clearance is compromised, the testosterone to estrogen ratio in men shifts in a direction that compounds the DHT problem. Sleep deprivation elevates cortisol, which drives the inflammatory signaling that keeps PSA elevated. Everything in the system talks to everything else. This is precisely why the one supplement approach almost never delivers the results men are hoping for. You can't pull a single lever in a machine that has 15 interconnected ones and expect the whole machine to change. There's a trap I've watched men fall into repeatedly in our community, and I fell into it myself in those early months. You implement the full protocol. The numbers start moving. You feel better, genuinely, meaningfully better. And that improvement starts to feel like permission to drop the pieces that feel like effort. The morning walk becomes 3 days a week instead of 6. The lycopene supplementation becomes occasional. The alcohol comes back on the weekends. And within a few months, the symptoms creep back. The conditions that drove elevated PSA in the first place, chronic inflammation, DHT excess, oxidative stress in prostate tissue, those conditions built up over years. They respond to sustained lifestyle changes. The minute I reframe this as a permanent way of living, rather than a temporary corrective protocol, was the minute the results became durable. Before I close, let me give you 3 specific things you can start doing today. Not as a distant goal, not when the timing is right, today. The first is what I call the morning tomato, not ketchup. Ketchup is loaded with sugar and has a fraction of the lycopene content you need. I mean 2 level tablespoons of real tomato paste, or half a cup of cooked tomato sauce, with a measured drizzle of olive oil, eaten at breakfast. Tomato paste has roughly 8 to 10 times the lycopene concentration of a fresh tomato, and the dietary fat from the olive oil dramatically increases how much lycopene your body actually absorbs from it. Make this a non-negotiable part of your morning. Within 30 days, you will have meaningfully shifted your lycopene status. The research suggests that change starts showing up in prostate tissue within 60 to 90 days of sustained intake. The second is a conversation to have at your very next doctor's appointment, one that most men never think to initiate. Ask your doctor, can we look at my PSA velocity rather than just today's number? PSA velocity is the rate of change over time, how fast the number is rising, holding, or falling, and it is often far more clinically informative than any single data point. If your PSA has gone from 2.5 to 3.2 to 4.1 over 3 years, that trajectory tells a very different story than a static 4.1 with no history. Ask your doctor to pull the trend. If you don't have a historical baseline, start building one now. Most men walk into those appointments as passive recipients of whatever news the test produces. Become an active participant in your own data. Your doctor will respect you for it. The third thing is a zinc assessment. Zinc is concentrated in the prostate gland at higher levels than in almost any other tissue in the human body, and it plays a direct role in moderating DHT activity and protecting prostate cells from oxidative damage. Research published on Healthline and WebMD points to mild zinc deficiency as genuinely common in men over 50, and most of them have no idea because it's not a standard part of routine blood work. Ask your doctor to add a serum zinc level to your next panel. If your levels are low, dietary sources like pumpkin seeds, oysters, and moderate amounts of grass-fed beef can help. And supplementation at 25 to 30 milligrams daily is worth a conversation with your provider. One additional thing worth flagging: several large studies, referenced by both WebMD and Healthline, have found that very high calcium supplementation, above about 1,500 milligrams daily, may be associated with increased prostate health risk in some men. If you're currently taking a calcium supplement, bring that dosage up with your doctor and double check whether you actually need it at that level. A few weeks after that third PSA test, I sat back across from my urologist one more time. He had all 3 printed results laid flat on the desk between us: 8, 2.3, 2.1. He was quiet for a moment, longer than doctors usually are, and then he said, "I've been practicing for over 20 years. I've seen results like this maybe a handful of times. Whatever combination of things you've put together, the numbers validate it. Don't stop." He still sees me every 6 months. I still take every test seriously, but I walk out of that building now without the weight I used to carry in my chest on the drive there. I walk out feeling like I am genuinely working with my body rather than waiting for it to fail me again. That shift from feeling like your body is a threat to feeling like it's something you can actually partner with, that's the transformation this journey has been about for me. The PSA number is the proof, but what the number actually represents is sleeping through the night, taking that road trip with your sons, standing on the first tee on a Saturday morning without calculating where the nearest bathroom is, feeling like yourself. If any of what I've shared today reached you, if you're somewhere in the middle of this right now and it feels lonely and frightening, I want you to know that's exactly why this channel exists. I share everything I learn, every piece of new research I come across, every update from the community of men walking this same road. Subscribe if you want to keep going through this together. I post every single week, and every video is grounded in the same thing: lived experience, real data, and honest results. The tomato app I mentioned, the one I've been using to track my protocol, the link is right there in the pinned comment below. If you're serious about understanding your own patterns and making this kind of protocol actually stick, that's where I'd send you. You don't have to figure this out alone. I didn't, and you really shouldn't have to.